My guest at this time is Alaska Republican Governor Mike Dunleavy. He was elected governor in November of 2018, but is already the target, and has been for months now, of an aggressive recall effort as a result of his budget-cutting efforts. The recall effort reportedly gathered more than 49,000 signatures, but was recently rejected for a ballot by the State Division of Elections. Recall supporters are now challenging that ruling in court. And, Governor, thanks very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me, and congratulations for having this show.
Thank you very much. This fight is primarily about your efforts to rein in spending due to budgetary issues related to the fact that oil revenues are not what they used to be, which is a very important part of the Alaska economy. What was your plan when entering office? How did you prioritize the budget cuts that you thought needed to be made?
Oh, very good question. So we've been struggling with a budget gap for some years, ever since oil took a tumble from the highs of $150 a barrel down to 26 here just a few years ago. And so we've got about a $1.6 billion deficit. When I ran in October of last year during the campaign, oil was back up to $85 a barrel, which would have given Alaska an extra $2 billion in revenue. At that point, a month before the election, we had figured that we could do a step-down approach to try and close this gap over 3 or 4 years. By December 28th, oil hit $54 a barrel. And so we had to make some difficult decisions quickly. We have a budget that we had a deadline to revise by February 13th. And as a result, we put in some pretty stiff reductions. And really, there were reductions across the board, and they hit a lot of programs. There's no doubt about it. They hit programs that touched upon a debt reimbursement for municipalities, the university, and hit some of our vulnerable populations, homelessness, and some of our seniors. But without those reductions, we would have had and maintained about a $1.6 billion gap, and we would have gone through our savings this year, in which we'd have no savings left, and we'd be staring at some pretty stiff draconian taxes. So we put in those reductions. We reduced the deficit by about 40%. And as a result, there are a number of people that are upset. But you have to go back 2 months into the election. There were people talking about a recall, folks on the left, because they didn't like our approach to our agenda, which is develop more resources to create new wealth, create more jobs, make sure that we have better outcomes in our programs, such as education, and, of course, the budget reductions. And so where we're at now is the recall petitioners were denied the recall on the ballot by our Division of Elections, but they're taking that to court. And they are well-funded, and they're well-funded by groups outside as well, including national unions and those that oppose any type of resource development in Alaska.
Well, let's dig into their argument a little bit and get your response to that. Your critics say your budget cutting was excessive or irresponsible or reckless, depending on the adjective they want to use. For example, they point to 41% of the funding to the University of Alaska system was cut. They believe that will make the schools less attractive to students. They also say tens of millions in dollars in Medicaid cuts were made, which suggests that poor Alaskans now face higher health care costs. What's your response to those sorts of criticisms?
Well, first of all, we didn't cut 41% of the university's budget. That's just simply not true. It's less than 17% that was reduced. In terms of the Medicaid issues, we certainly reduced programs, especially optional programs that the state has to pay for. But they don't offer any alternative or solution to the program other than taxes, and they'd be pretty stiff. They would be pretty stiff taxes. And what they also forget to mention is it's not a dictatorship. The governor proposes a budget. The legislature reviews the budget. The governor can then veto, but the legislature in the end decides if they want to support the veto or override the vetoes. The vetoes were not overridden by the legislature. So they leave out a very important part, and that is, in the end, the legislature has the final say.
And so they failed to override your veto, so where does that actually leave things? Have they actually passed anything? The
veto stand. And there's a reduction of $600 million. And as we go into this next budget session, we're having conversations with legislators and groups, individuals, et cetera, to see what this budget should look like going into the future. But the gap still remains, so we're going to have to make some decisions on whether these are going to be there's going to be deep reductions, or whether Alaskans want to look at revenue measures, which the indications are that most Alaskans still would prefer that we do reductions. How steep? That's going to be the question that will be answered over the next couple of weeks.
Governor, you mentioned that the only alternative you heard from folks was for either new taxes or tax increases. You mentioned they seem quite draconian to you. What exactly were a lot of folks recommending there? What kind of taxes or what kind of rates?
Well, so there have been people that talked about income taxes. Well, it would have to cover the $1.6 billion gap. So people are talking about income taxes. Some people were talking about payroll taxes. And keep in mind, these taxes were tried by the last administration, and they were rejected by the legislature. And the last administration, the governor, was not elected to a second term because Alaskans did not want to go down the road of stiff taxation. We also have a thing called the permanent fund dividend, which is income generated from oil royalties that the people of Alaska take part in. And there are those that want to either severely reduce that PFD or eliminate it. In other words, government politicians know how to spend your money better than you do. And so that's the question right now is how do we balance this budget? How do we close this gap? Alaskans are still calling for reductions and efficiencies. Some are calling for taxation. Some are calling for a reduction or elimination of that PFD and use that money to close the gap. So we're still having these conversations, and we're going to see where we're going to go here over the next couple of weeks when we submit our budget. But it's going to be a very interesting discussion this legislative session, there's no doubt about it.
How are you preparing for the possibility, anyway, that the recall supporters win their court fight?
Well, if they win their court fight, there are groups stood up on our behalf that would challenge that. So I would see a protracted court battle going on here. But nonetheless, in the end, if it makes it on the ballot, we just have to run a campaign that shows the people of Alaska that the reason we won in the first place at 51% to 44 was because of our agenda. And the agenda was to tackle this issue, preserve the permanent fund dividend, and not impose draconian taxes on the people of Alaska. So that's why we went with the steep reductions. And so we'll just have to keep having those discussions with the people of Alaska. And in the end, they'll have a chance to vote if this makes it to the ballot. And they'll have to decide if it's the agenda that we ran on, the agenda that we implemented, is still the agenda that they want.
Where are the Republicans on this? From what I've read, at least some of them have seen cuts to programs that they consider high priority, so they're not very excited about it. But for the most part, are most Republicans still with you on this, or is it kind of a mixed bag?
Yes. Yeah, most Republicans are, but you know how it goes. Everybody wants to reduce the budget as long as it doesn't touch them. And when you have a budget deficit this large, that's very difficult. So it's going to touch everybody. And quite frankly, it should. Meaning we should all contribute to reducing this because we're all in this together. But for the most part, Republicans are still with us. Democrats aren't. And the folks in between, we have a large undeclared and nonpartisan population. I would say for the most part, those folks are still with us as well, but time will tell. And we'll see how this recall pans out. But again, we're merely implementing an agenda that we ran on. As a matter of fact, I asked one of the recall folks, or one of the folks that supports the recall, I said, what's up? What's the deal? And they said, we didn't think that you would actually implement the agenda that you ran on. And as a result, we're opposing it. And so I thought that was kind of fascinating because they're so used to politicians running and telling the people one thing and then doing something else that they were surprised I told the people one thing and carried out the agenda.
Well, you've been talking about a serious financial crisis in your own state, revolving around $1.6 billion. Here in Washington, of course, we're talking about trillion-dollar annual deficits and a national debt that's at least $22 trillion now, if not higher than that. So what lessons would you pass along to folks who want to cut spending in a way to get things back in order? How tough is it?
Well, if you can print money, you can avoid the decision today. But as you mentioned, it's $22 to $23 trillion in debt. That's going to come back to haunt us one way or another. In a way, I'm actually glad that the states don't have that ability to print money because we have to live within a certain means, certain parameters, certain sideboards. But we have to decide what's most important, because we can't be all things to all people. We're trying to do that at the federal level, and as a result, we're putting a debt on future generations that may not be something that could be sustained. It may cause some severe economic issues and financial issues for this country. So we have to decide what's important. We have to separate the needs from the wants. I think part of the problem is today everything seems to be a need, when in fact some of these things need to be categorized as wants.
Last question for you, Governor. Here in Washington, as I'm sure you're well aware, it seems like most folks don't have an attention span that can consume more than one topic, especially right now with impeachment hearings going on and so forth. And so it kind of paralyzes everything else. What's the situation in Alaska? Are things kind of on hold while this recall fight plays out, or are you still able, and the legislature able to get things done on other issues or even related issues?
No, it's a good question. So we continue to focus on governing. Despite what folks have said, they said that when we reduce the budget, the reductions would crater the economy. The fact of the matter is, we're now at record low unemployment. Our GDP is up again in the second quarter, 4.1%, outpacing the rest of the country. We brought on 2,000 additional jobs here in Alaska in September. We have billions of dollars of new investment on the North Slope oil fields. We have a $500 million investment at our Ted Stevens International Airport, which is the second busiest cargo airport in the country and the fifth busiest in the world. There's a lot of great things happening. We continue to govern. You just won't read about this in the papers is the issue.
Governor, we'll continue to follow the story. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today, sir. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. And if people want to take a look at a site that's supporting us, it's standtallwithmike.com, standtallwithmike.com. Thanks a lot. We'll talk with you.
Absolutely. Alaska Republican Governor Mike Dunleavy, elected 2018. Now a major recall debate happening in the state of Alaska. Standtallwithmike.com to learn more from his perspective on this debate. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.